friends. So, in the series of different aspects and dimensions of environmental impact assessment, that is EIA process, today we will discuss about global perspectives or global practices related to EIA process. So, that we can know about certain strengths or weaknesses of EIA processes which are followed across the world. So, today's lecture's content is listed here. For example, approaches for different stages of EIA process in various countries we will discuss, that will include like requirement of strategic environmental assessment, that is SEA, and then selection of different parameters for screening processes which also vary from country to country. Some countries discuss about independent impacts on certain aspects or components of the environment, whereas other countries they take the cumulative or combined effect of the different activities on the environment. And also like public participation varies from country to country. Some countries are very particular about it and they include public participation, feedback and their constructive involvement at several stages of the complete project, whereas in other countries it may be little bit symbolic or at preliminary stages only. Then there are cultural impact assessments which are extension of social impacts or socio-economic dimensions. So, that is also one part which some countries give quite significant emphasis and other countries just do it superficially, you can say. Then we will see like comparative overview of EIA process in developed countries and in comparison to developing countries, plus some aspects of Indian EIA system we will discuss in that context. And at last we will see what are different gaps or loopholes in EIA process, which sometimes some agencies or they use to cut short or to get those kind of short directions rather than going in very integrated way. So, those things we can discuss and at last we will conclude this lecture. So, first of all we see like requirement of SEA, that is strategic environment assessment, in different countries have different ways of doing it. For example, in Kenya, in Africa and Tanzania, in these two countries, the legal provisions have been integrated along with EIA legislation, whereas in some countries they are separated. For example, in Canada the separate laws are there and regulations for SEA. So, means of course, they are considered and they are incorporated in a larger framework, but they are not linked within a single documents as some countries do. And then there are hybrid approach where these requirements are dealt with sectoral basis, like for particular sector, transport sector or energy sector. So, those kind of sectors are taken care of through different legislations as New Zealand has done for this. Now, we see the different approaches of selecting various parameters of EIA. So, there are three broader framework like environment centered parameters, where we discuss lot of things from environmental perspective. Other one is development center, means the primary objective is to have development related projects and their implications are considered with more focus. And then there is third hybrid approach, where both environmental as well as development related parameters are considered and discussed in detail. So, for example, in environmental centered factors criteria, we see that what are the impacts on the environment, that is the primary thing, and in development those activities or projects are primary things. So, you can see this one table where environment related impact centered parameters are considered for screening. That means, we see like how much emissions are there of different pollutants. So, this is one example, and then what will be the impact on the air quality, how much it will deteriorate or there will not be any impact, those kind of things. So, in screening process, this hybrid approach India follows, basically in our country we follow this hybrid approach, where environmental and development concerns are taken together, but in some countries like only environment is more important and development factors are taken secondary position. Then there is, as we discussed, that development related centered or development centered parameters are taken into account as a priority thing in EIA screening. So, that way we see like pre-construction activities or their impact, socio-economic impacts. So, suppose some project is giving lot of employment, then that is considered more important in certain economies. So, that way some differences are there, but ultimately of course environment is there and we cannot ignore the environmental impact, and that is why this EIA is there, after all, environmental impact assessment in totality. Well, if you see like European Union EIA screening related parameters, so you can see like for example, topography, land use changes, water bodies, those kind of things. Then perceived risk on the human health, all these parameters are taken care of in that particular screening activity with the basis of some checklist. Yeah, like we have earlier discussed in a checklist that this will impact positively yes or no, negatively yes or no, those kind of things are there for screening purpose. When we go further in screening process, like European Union member countries which classify projects in terms of category 1 and category 2. So, those categories are different, and then some case to case basis things are considered as per their total impact, whether it is category 1 or category 2 or the category 3, which is kind of very severe. So, here it is it is clearly mentioned that category 1 projects, as in Peru, this is one example for screening in the Peru, one country. So, only an environmental impact statement or EIS is required, means that means those category projects are not very highly impactful in terms of negative influences on the environment. So, that is basically low environmental impacts. So, those projects are listed as category 1 projects. Then category seconds are like moderate impact. So, semi detailed environmental impact study is carried out, EIA-SD, which is called in category second. And then category third are like detailed environmental impact assessment is carried out, because those projects are supposed to give very large impacts on the environment. Well, there is another example of Kenya. So, in this some special features of EIA are considered in screening process. Okay. So, those are like involvement of environmental practitioners at screening stage. So, those who have special knowledge, okay, of those particular projects, so they are taken into those committees, and if some misleading information is supplied by the project proponents, then there are provisions for punishment like imprisonment or large fine, those kind of things are there. Okay. Then cumulative impacts are also important. In certain countries cumulative impacts are given importance, because as sometimes whole is greater than part. It is there is a saying that the whole is greater than the total sum of the parts, that is the synergic impact, you can call that. So, like in Canada, the cumulative effects are taken care of, physico-chemical impacts, then biodiversity impacts, all total impacts are taken. Whereas in China only individual impacts, only component related impacts are taken care of, they do not go for detailed cumulative impacts. So, the example of cumulative impact to illustrate or to visualize, for example, if you want to study the air quality of megacity Delhi, so it is not only the local source. If we want to assess the air quality, then it is not only the emission inventory of the local sources, but because it is in the downwind direction of several other prominent sources of air pollution, like stubble burning in nearby states. So, those also really impact the air quality of Delhi. So, that means if you want to study the air quality of megacity Delhi, then you have to take the regional contributors into account, otherwise your modeling efforts will not be proper. You may end up like less prediction, or the estimation may be lower than what can be actual in the real sense, right. So, those are the cumulative impacts which should be taken into account if you want to go for these kind of air quality assessment in cities which have more than localized sources or regional sources. Impact is quite prominent. Well, mitigation measures for individual impacts are taken into certain countries. For example, one is for the China. So, there are some legislations which take into account, and only component wise component, like only air quality, then water quality or a particular ecosystem, and it is a compartment kind of impact study is taken care of. Well, another example of individual impact can be like some highways going through some, let us say, town or village nearby, and there may be like lot of noise. So, we have to have barriers. So, those noise barriers along the road, they are kind of addressing only the individual impact. Okay. Individual impact means they will only cater for the noise related impacts. Otherwise, if you go for other activities like sludge related treatment before dumping into the river. So, that the quality of the sludge after treatment must be okay as per the laws. Okay. Similarly, some efficient machines are used so that less fuel is burnt, less air quality deterioration is there because of that. So, these individual or compartment related activities may be there. There may be some activities according to the case by case. Well, then there are offsets of adverse environmental impact. That means by law some projects they give the license only when it is given some detailed project management plan that these negative impacts will be completely taken care of, means those kind of major technological measures or policy measures will be implemented before the end of the project, so that there is no negative impacts. So, in Mexico, in Brazil, those kind of approaches are included in their legislation. Well, then for example, one offset of the impacts related case studies there for in this particular Peru. Yeah, in this Peru mines related activity was there, and there was impact assessment study which did not give much care for other or much impact for the other activities or components, but there was only one aspect that potential destruction may be there for endangered shrub species, means overall EIA was goody, but this particular aspect was quite negative, and so the conservation program was carried out properly at the large scale, and only then this EIA was given. Responsibility for preparing EIA reports also vary from country to country. For example, in India we have this Quality Council of India. The empanelment is given for certain organizations and individual experts, only those can carry out the EIA. This is the recent development, and as per the notification only those kind of organizations should carry out. Otherwise, earlier there was this practice that some people will having not even the right qualification, they could carry out the EIA studies, and there were very low quality of EIA studies earlier. But later on this very good important provision was made. In USA, government agencies more responsible for carrying out EIA studies, but in other countries there are licensing process, means some registered consultants or agencies are given permission for carrying out these studies. In Indonesia, individual with some certification. So, every country has their own way to allow or disallow who can carry out the EIA. There may be review process also after certain years, and whether their expertise are giving good EIA reports or not. So, those things are also considered after renewing the license. Public participation is one more aspect which is quite varying from country to country. For example, in Canada they have at several stages they invite the public for their feedback, and they consider their feedback as the positive aspects, and according to they address their issues, right. Well, but public is also defined, public participation is defined in different way. So, in case of like China, they say that some participatory hearing is there, or some groups are there. So, they just consult them and they say that okay, this public hearing is done, which may not be as exhaustive as done in other countries, for example, in Canada. In Denmark, like some legal persons or some companies which are directly or indirectly affected, they are the part of this process, and some associations also they can be invited for their feedback. Well, in USA this is one illustration of the public participation, how detailed public participation was carried out. See, 52 pre-scoping listening tours were carried out. So, that is the very detailed one, which is one example how public really participate in decision making of those projects which are related to socio-economic as well as environmental impacts. And 4 public hearing was carried out after this licensing was there, and then some community meetings were there. So, it was a complete detailed participation of the public before getting this project. There are certain review processes for EIA, like European Union has given very detailed guidelines for review process of environment impact statement, and before decision making all those impact assessment related statements are studied, and all components are critically examined before it is given permission. So, it is done either by the government agencies, or some professionals are requested, or they are given some honorarium for carrying out these activities. In like Cameroon, this is one example of Ministry of Environment, Nature Protection and Sustainable Development. So, they do environmental and social impact assessment, okay, ESIA, and this can undertake on-site visits to qualitatively verify the information included, like assessment and the feedback by the concerned public, and outcomes are transmitted in a report. So, they also do very systematic way, very systematic way, and participation of the public is there, and it is well documented. Okay. Then if we talk about like global best features which should be followed, or for monitoring purpose as given or enlisted by United Nations Environment Program. So, at regular intervals sufficient information should be available, and this should be able to manage the adverse impacts based on the monitoring data. If there are availability of the data is there, then it should ensure indigenous community participation in environmental management. That is very important, because at times you might have seen various agitations when local population feel that some project has been imposed on them. Okay. So, that is a very negative outcome of the project proposal. If you can't build the trust in the public, there may be several problems in the future when you are going to implement the project. So, the local indigenous people should be taken in faith, in trust, by giving them full information about the project's benefits, which will be for them and for the society at large. Then competent enforcement agencies are there, which can be there for their powers are their legal status. Then they can create some regional monitoring networks also, so that proper feedbacks are always available. Well, this is one example, like so best practices examples are taken from different countries. So, like for in case of Canada, cultural impacts in EIA process is very important. So that the local population like tribes and their customs or their historical and archaeological those places, they should not be disturbed. Okay? They should not be disturbed, and their conservation is the prime importance of that whole process. So, one interesting example here of this Laurentia project in Canada, where significant adverse environmental effects to the fish and fish habitat and air quality, human health, socio-economic, those kind of entities were estimated because of this particular port related project, and it was estimated that those impacts may be very high or very negative. So, ultimately this project was not commissioned. So, that means if you do the detailed analysis of the environmental impacts of different components, whether aquatic life and the human health etcetera, and you carry out critical examination, then decision making can be quite objective rather than subjective. There are in New Zealand also cultural impacts related provisions are there in their EIA related process. So, health and socio-economic conditions are given prime importance, physical or cultural heritage, if there are some places like that. So, they should be intact. Then the current use of the lands and resources for traditional purposes, if it is impacted drastically, then it should be avoided, other methods should be used, some alternative methods can be proposed. Then structure, site or objective that is of historical or archaeological significance, so that should not be disturbed. And the impact on community knowledge, okay, those local communities, they have some traditional knowledge, and if some project influence that community living in such a way that that knowledge can be lost in future. So, again that should not be there. So, some alternative approaches should be there, so that the preservation or conservation of those local practices or traditional knowledge can be ensured. Well, then there are formal and legal basis for EIA processes. So, we can see the tabulated form comparison of developed countries and developing countries, and also given for India. So, well framed EIA legislation are there in developed countries like Canada, and they do very systematically and very exhaustive process is there. In developing countries, sometimes they have some activities where even EIA is not required. Okay? In some African countries still there are several activities which are just done without any EIA. And in India, there is of course formal legislation which is based on Environmental Protection Act of 1986, and slowly we are moving towards those kind of well framed EIA legislation as it exists in developed countries. Okay, when we talk about public participation, so this is very active involvement in case of developed countries, as we have seen the example of Canada and America at several stages they do this public participation. In developing countries it is picking up, and in limited way involvement of public is being encouraged. Okay. In India also now it is going on, and it is increasing day by day. Well, impact type and alternatives. So, that is again part of the total EIA process in developed countries, means they also talk about different alternative approaches to carry out that project, not only one way of doing that project. But in developing countries this is still not in practice, and in India also we go for only one kind of proposal. When we talk about language and technical approaches, how it is communicated or disseminated, then in local languages also developed countries they publish their reports in several languages. In developing countries some dominating language is there, which is primary language of communication or administration. In that language those reports are available. So, same story is there in case of India, although now bilingual reports are sometimes available. Like in English and in Hindi, some states are also coming up with some local language translation, but still that is not very popular. but in future it will boost or accelerate this process. Then expertise level, for example, in developed countries they have many individuals who are well qualified to do EIA, and very good organizations which have the pool of experts, they can carry out EIA in very objective way. In developing countries, expertise is limited, and slowly expertise is building up. And in India also, as we have this organization which do empanelment of experts and those organizations. So, we are now having the pool of experts. Now, we talk about certain gaps or loopholes in EIA process, which sometimes in some countries people use to have shortcuts kind of things, which is not good in totality. For example, suppose in certain legislations there is like length of the road, after this length the detailed EIA is required. So, what those agencies do, they split that road project into different parts, so that the total length is not there, and in that case they can do away with the detailed EIA, rather they go for quick speedy rapid EIA kind of things and something like that. So, this is one approach which is salami or slicing approach. Salami slicing approach is popularly known by people in this area, project splitting. So, bypassing EIA process is not a good thing, but when unless we do this integration or holistic combined cumulative impact assessment, it is possibility is there that people can do these splitting. So, this is one case or example of project splitting in Spain. That was a big project of this corridor from this point to that one, this Mediterranean corridor rail line map. You can see it was very long corridor, and this was broken into different projects. So, ultimately those environmental groups, they agitated, they gave their representations, and the Spain was forced to carry out its EIA. Otherwise, after splitting there was no need of detailed EIA. Then similarly, this of the UK, some urban development related projects at White City and Crystal Palace, those were divided into small activities. Okay. So, those are the ways of splitting projects and avoiding the EIA. Well, then how to avoid those project splitting kind of things, or these gaps or loopholes. So, there are ways. For example, in Portugal, apply EIA below the threshold if necessary. So, that means there are legislations or agencies which can give the orders that even if this threshold limit is not crossed, EIA can be there. So, there is a possibility, means if you go and say that we feel that although this project is not violating or exceeding those limits in terms of project cost or the length of the highway, but we feel that its activities can influence certain locations or habitat, then government can order for this EIA. In Sweden, assess the scope of the project in the screening phase. So, at the screening phase also one can give this order that okay, EIA will be required for this particular activity. And in case by case, in case of certain countries like Spain, Finland, Denmark, as we have just seen one example of this Spain, that in this case it was ultimately EIA was required. So, other countries examples are also there. According those projects worthiness, EIA can be taken care of even if there are some gaps or loopholes. Like in Nigeria, one this practice is there that on the name of public health or safety, if some projects are given that kind of category, then that is exempted from EIA. So, some people may take advantage of this. So, one has to be vigilant that if some project is titled as the health related or safety related, but ultimately its own activities may damage the public health, then the EIA must be there. Okay. In Indonesia, then there are certain activities which are exempted from the obligation of EIA. So, those activities are listed, and in conclusion we can say that there are several approaches of different varying impacts which are used by different countries for at different stages of the EIA, and some countries are very good in detailed EIA, but other countries are still evolving their EIA approach to carry out an integrated and holistic environmental impact assessment. And then there are best practices available which are adopted by some other countries to minimize the significant impact on the environment, and more constructive participation of public is necessary. We have seen some examples how public participation can really improve the project's viability towards the local community and socio-economic factors. And then EIA process need to be implemented in spirit, not just words. That is very very important. It is our not only the legal duty, but it is also the moral obligation for us that our activities should not harm other communities as well as other flora or fauna that is the part of the ecosystem. So, the EIA is a very important activity which should be carried out in words as well as in spirit, so that we can ensure that environmental conservation is there and there is no degradation of the environment. Well, these are the references which you can go through to get more information about this topic, and thank you for your kind attention. Now, in future we will see different case studies. I am sure you will enjoy those case studies to get better visualization of environmental impact assessment activity. Thank you.